and sustainable development in Africa and in the world. I thank you particularly, Professor Crispin Hemson, for joining us today. And I know that you are familiar also to this platform. And I thank everybody else also for coming, for joining us. And I would like now to introduce the theme and the speaker. And the theme is Educating for Peace in a Context of Violence, a very important topic. And the speaker is Professor Crispin Michael Hemson. Crispin has had a lifelong career in education from primary to tertiary level. He has served as head of the School of Education at the University of Natal, at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa. He has been director of the Center of Nonviolence since 2009. Crispin Hemson is also an environmental activist and a seasoned researcher. He has also contributed a chapter to our next book on peace studies for sustainable development in Africa. It's a pleasure having you, Crispin. And I would like to ask everybody to please mute your microphones and welcome Crispin for your presentation. You are welcome, Crispin.
Thank you very much, George. I'm hard-pressed to compete with the music, and I'm not going to be attempting to join it as an act of charity to those with us today, because I don't think I would do it justice, really. Are you able to see this?
Yes, perfect.
All right. So I've cheated here. I suddenly put in a word just to make it a bit clearer, because this is an evolving presentation. And the word I've added is educators. So I'm not just educating for peace, but educating educators for peace in a context of violence. To make it clearer exactly what I'm focusing on. So as George has said, I'm at ICON, International Center of Nonviolence. I am, as of the 1st of September, no longer director. Professor Alain Trudin is now the director. I'm still there for the time being, at least. So I want to, in a sense, really problematize the issues of developing educators for peace in context of violence. And I've put there a note at the bottom, those who teach as acts of nonviolence, those whose teaching is itself an act of nonviolence, which is quite a broad way of looking at the role of educators. Apart from problematizing the issues, I want to report findings from a specific project where we were developing facilitators for dialogues in a conflictual setting. I'm going to deal with the context of violence in South Africa, and then focus more specifically on violence within education before moving on to the study itself and its findings. By all means, interrupt or scream quietly if things need attention on the way, like if you can't hear me. So what do I mean by educators for peace? So it's not exactly the same as peace education, though it's obviously relevant to it. It would apply to people teaching in any area. So we might apply this to people teaching chemistry or any of the social sciences or geography or languages. So in my mind, it has to do with whether teaching itself demonstrates nonviolence, is an act of nonviolence, and whether teaching strengthens in the educator and the student the capacity for nonviolence. So this would apply most obviously in the area of peace education. It applies across the board, whether we are talking about early childhood development, whether we're talking about sports education, community education, and so on. The other day, Clive Harbour, who was head of department at Birmingham, but had been head of department at the University of Natal as it was then, before I was head, he presented a seminar with us, and his thesis was that peace education is incompatible with schools as they are. And his reasoning was that it doesn't work if you try to do peace education in a context within which education is structured around violent relationships. And that's an issue I'll come back to. You might try and do it, but you're going to be at odds with the system. That was his key point. But I want to deal what do I mean by context of violence? And so we have the work of, in particular, Tani Adams, who worked in Latin America, and she builds on the WHO definition of violence in using the term chronic violence. It's measured across 3 dimensions of intensity, space, and time. So the easiest way of measuring violence is probably homicide, violent deaths, because they are the least easy to miss. And where you have rates of violent death at least twice the average for the country income category. So maybe richer countries have fewer homicides, but where even a rich country has higher levels of homicides, that might be an indicator of chronic violence. And it's over a longer period of time as well. So that's intensity, time, and then it's across different spaces in the society. And in our context, for example, in South Africa, we have very high levels of domestic violence. We have very high levels of, say, community crime in communities, but also vigilantism and violence in schools, which I'll come back to. So that violence is always being reproduced. So in our context, for example, we have very high levels of violence in the taxi industry, in the construction industry, in the tobacco industry. So however we define violence, it permeates the society. So if we look specifically at South Africa as one of Africa's most violent societies, these are the figures drawn from the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. And they did a global study on homicide, 2019. And there you can see plotted how over periods of time this has changed in South Africa. Despite some perceptions, in fact, violent homicides were highest just at the start of, immediately before and at the start of democracy in South Africa, and came down significantly. These rates were improving significantly until about 2010. And since then, there's been a very worrying increase. And in other societies, you'll see other Southern African societies. Lesotho, we don't have very good statistics for, but it is very high. Other countries in Africa mainly well below this, but there may well be some exceptions, possibly the DRC, Central African Republic, and so on. So violence in South Africa, you see, by the way, there's a line across at the bottom. The global incidence is 6.1, I think. Victims of intentional homicide per 100,000 population. At present in South Africa, it's around 40. This is very, very high. And this is very gendered as well. And in fact, what's often missed in South Africa is that men are the overwhelming majority of those who are actually murdered. But the female homicide rate is at least 6 times higher than the rate worldwide. And half, at least, of female victims are killed by their male intimate partners. So that's in the particular area of gender-based violence. But it's also in our society, and this is not always, this is because of our particular racial history, the groups most likely to be killed are young, Black, and colored men in our context. In South African education, there have been 2 major studies, and there's ample evidence on every form of violence within South African education. One of our students from the Edgewood campus was murdered in the classroom by one of their students at a school that I know quite well. A friend of mine who got a job in a primary school in a rural area was very, very successful, and was then almost killed, almost certainly because he was doing well and he was seen as a threat to somebody else who wanted promotion. Fortunately, he survived. He's been able to go back into teaching despite very, very serious injuries. And we have increasing evidence as to violence within higher education. I was recently working with student leadership at our university, and when I asked about what had been the worst experiences, the best and worst experiences of being at our university, women began talking with great anger about the levels of rape and sexual harassment. But we also have homicides of students by fellow students, and every form of gender-based violence, including violence against sexual minorities. These are well documented now. So one of the particular aspects I just want to point to is that we have been a violent society for a long period of time. And the violence, of course, has taken the form of colonialism and then apartheid. In our particular context, in this part of South Africa, the political violence of the late 80s and early 1990s really exposed huge numbers of the population to traumatic events. And so this is a South African paper writing about male young men in particular trying to get some sense of control in their lives by engagement in aggression, violence, and more antisocial acts. I mean, if I didn't need to be reminded, there was a cash and transit heist just outside the entrance to our campus 10 days ago, and a young man was shot in the leg by a security guard. His brother said, just as well, the paramedics got there before the police, otherwise the police might have shot him dead. And that young man is very well known to me. It's my neighbor's son. So we are very close always to these issues of violence. What started the research project I'm going to report on was a series of extreme events in July 2021 in this part of South Africa, and outbreaks of intense community tensions and violence. There were 354 people dead for various reasons. Some of them were things like people suffocating on a bridge in an incident that I know a lot about, in a rush to go and loot at a shopping center. And so these events, in our view at ICON and elsewhere, were only possible because of the high levels of trauma in our society. And these are often related to racial histories and the trauma around race, the trauma around poverty, hunger, the failure of our educational systems, which are expensive, but not very effective. And so we had proposed, we being ourselves in a related center duty independently, in fact, proposed that there should be community dialogues. So we, then ICON set up a short course for facilitators. And as it happened, I had started a doctorate working in the area of this area of educating for peace. And this provided the actual intervention stage of an action research study. So let me just deal a little bit with theory. So I quite like this work by Zemblias. And he writes, he draws on Bourdieu, the French sociologist, and focuses on work that Bourdieu did not go into around emotional capital. So it's about emotional practices, about how we use emotions for positive or for negative purposes, how there are certain emotional practices of that could lead either into violence or potentially into non-violence. And he connects this with Bourdieu's idea of habitus, the socially constituted system of a product of history that produces individual and collective practices. So a habitus has the great advantage from a theoretical point of view here, that it doesn't separate out the individual from the collective. That anyone's habitus is formed both individually through individual experience and collective experiences that very often are shared. And these experiences become internalized. And as they become internalized, we lose touch with how they got generated in the first place. And so this is not a binary approach. This does not separate out agency from structure. It sees habitus as something which surrounds us as people, but it is not, according to Zemblias, deterministic, which is one of the criticisms of Bourdieu, that potentially one sees oneself as purely constructed through social forces and individual experiences, and the opportunity for change is denied. So one of the purposes within education would be to analyze and change emotional norms, reveal the historicity and contingency that have shaped the limits and possibilities of teachers and students' understanding of themselves, individually and collectively. So I think that's what we were trying to do in this short course. You see there I won't go into detail, but you can read the different elements of the purpose. Ambitious, dealing with developing understanding, addressing experiences, enhancing skills, theoretical development, and so on. When I looked at it again today, I was thinking that there's not much here about self-awareness, and I think that's something that's missing in there. So, from a research point of view, I'm presenting a qualitative case study of this course. And what did we learn about the context, about the students, about ourselves in the process? Drawing on data primarily from video recordings, because most of the course was online and was recorded. But we also had very productive and rich reflection and planning sessions of the staff members. And in addition, we had notes, field notes, and evaluation comments. And then from that, we developed certain themes, which, well, I was responsible for that. I think fairly standard ethical issues that we use pseudonyms, be able to check back with participants on what they learned in the process, what we understand was happening. One of the things that made me think about was, what are the indicators of a peaceful process? And I've said some of them out there, speaking fully and openly about themselves without communicating defensiveness, emotions easily expressed and spoken about. But people say and indicate that they are learning something new. The way conflicts are handled leads to greater openness and not to defensiveness. But something that really struck me, it was actually the last session that we are in, which was a face-to-face session, was that this sense of Ubuntu, in the sense of like pleasure in being with other people, that idea of pleasure and enjoying the company and enjoying the interaction, which I think is something really valuable. So there's a listing. We were quite a diverse group, perhaps very strongly tilted towards Black African people, very diverse in terms of age. Well, there was only one over 70, but that's only amongst the students. And you see a range of people from very different backgrounds, but all involved in some way in education, maybe just as tutors in our general education program, community people, environmental activists, and so on. And there is our staff grouping, mainly women. Okay, so that was the sequence of sessions set out there, and we struggled. What we struggled with was we were not allowed to have face-to-face sessions at first. We could only do it at the end for one workshop and one early this year. That was because of COVID, and so we had to do things online, and we really struggled there. People didn't always have good devices. They often had poor reception, and then we found using Teams quite difficult. But we did do some things. Within that, we succeeded in having dialogues on gender, race, and in the final session this year on age. People may wonder why I, of all people, would want to bring age into it, but as the years pass, I seem to see this as more significant. All right. So, and we would put people into the role of facilitators, and that was very productive when that happened. So here are the themes. So first of all, well, from the beginning, we were convinced that we needed to create a sense of safety. And the sense, only when there's sufficient safety do people feel the possibility of nonviolence being possible. And so we did this quite carefully, but by negotiating how we'd work together, by talking about this from time to time. And there's Valerie Walkerdin's comment on this, writing about how do we enable people to move to tackle the more challenging issues that Zemblias refers to. And we want things to be challenging, and we want people to tackle issues that may otherwise not really be easily possible. So somebody's kindly brought me a cup of tea, which is very nice. I won't interrupt the session to drink it. And then Anthony Collins, this is a reference to somebody who was at UKZN and now in Melbourne, Australia, writes about how participants are able to focus attention on their experiences and emotions, and are able to listen to the experiences of others without feeling the need to defend, to put up the defenses, so they can listen, and in the process in which their sense of themselves and their sense of others. And he was writing in the context of teaching on sensitive issues. And I think my view is that we did succeed in creating, at least for most of the time, a sense of a safe space. And here's a quote, some quotations. It's actually men talking in the dialogue on gender. So this is the voices only of men speaking. And generally, men in dialogues on gender, in my experience, can very easily become very defensive, and can into justifications and explanations which are not helpful. But I thought that in this dialogue, they really went straight to the heart of the matter, which was their socialization and what had been done to them that impacted on them now. And Siyabonga, who's a student, it's obviously a pseudonym, he said he was part of this. He said, you only know it was different when you're outside. So we had created, if you like, an outside space, a space that was different to the space he'd been in growing up in. And I never felt outside till I came out, as it were. But while he was in that context, he felt he had to, I just had to sort of go with everybody, go with the flow. And I think that's a really interesting thing about how that habitus is created, through the sense of this is inevitable. It's my individual experiences. It's the collective experience of boys and men in this context. That's the way it is. And then, interestingly enough, somebody who was present there who organizes community dialogues says, this is the first time I reflected really on how one's childhood was like. And he talks about how traumatic it was. And this is, so we were exposing people to a sense of openness and depth, which they had previously not encountered. And that was one of the areas of success within this course. Interestingly enough, the woman who was facilitating the dialogue later said, oh, she thought she would have to sort of challenge the men, and didn't realize the men were actually very willing to speak about exactly where the problem areas were. And Anthony Collins actually makes the point that this work has the potential for triggering trauma from prior experiences. And so we need to have processes for containing emotions and enabling safety. So that the way we do this work has to be thoughtful, because at times people will raise issues which would be emotionally triggering for themselves or for others present. And we don't know in advance how it will be experienced. So Collins writes about the difficulties of this work, but also the value of doing it, because in our context, there are extremely few places where this kind of work is possible. The third theme, though, is that we're in a context where we've had reconciliation as a kind of, came with democracy. We have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And from that, there's been a sense of, well, you don't want to, dig up the past. So somebody talking about the difficulty of speaking about being white in that context. Indian-African interaction, well, like people retreating to rather guarded positions where you sort of validate the other person for being there, but we're not actually going to go into the areas of pain and hurt around that. And I must say my own work has become increasingly critical of this ethic of reconciliation, if it means that we silence the truth of what happened to people. And one of the phrases used in the course was, "Oh, do we really want to open up old wounds?" And maybe those wounds were never actually dealt with. What I think perhaps the most central thing for me in all of this course was that we were trying to rush ahead and cover all of this territory and reach those outcomes. And we were going much more slowly than we had thought possible. I mean, and when we actually managed it towards the end of the course to have a face-to-face workshop, we suddenly realized that, hold on, some people are not even very clear about what a facilitator does. We assumed it was clearer. And there was just, it just took more time. So we were trying to do too much. And we are up against everyone's socialization, the lack of the kind of development of the really more thoughtful, reflective skills that actually people need in a society. And yeah, so if we look at it in terms of that idea of habitus, we actually requiring people to shift their sense of self. And one of the participants wrote thus, context is usually interpreted according to a person's social conditioning. Even so, constantly my own perceptions or outlook of the world were challenged and inspired. My own prejudices and biases were overturned. Now, I mean, that is quite significant that that person reported that degree of change, even though in many ways we could see the limitations of what we were achieving. So, in fact, after the course, the interesting lecture at the University of Witwatersrand by von Holt, who takes this concept, Bourdieu's concept, and then says from his research work and engagement in trade union work, community context in South Africa, he says, no, we need to recognize there are different fields of practice, and there may be violence and corruption in one area, but not in another area. And so we think that we're making progress, but as soon as we change to a different field of practice, we realize what we're up against. And he puts that in particular to the economic structure and how it sets people up against each other, the urgency to get ahead of others, to get into the elite when the elite is very well looking after itself. So that raises the complexity of integrating nonviolence across different fields of practice. So Tiny Adams' work, do we really achieve nonviolence across these different sectors of society? But he gives one very important case of an informal settlement which had adopted a value of nonviolence that informed all of the practices in that community. It is absolutely remarkable because it meant that people had to engage in processes that constantly resolved difficult and challenging issues in nonviolent ways. And that's in itself is a very valuable case. Theme 5 was around binaries, that we often set up things like dialogues, and this wouldn't apply to all teaching, but sometimes when we work in this area, say around racism or gender, we get this binary development. But in reality, we had to work against this. And we did it, I think, fairly successfully in the gender dialogue, for example, and in the age dialogue, where people were able to step outside the us-them issue by reflecting clearly on their own experience. And experience is very, very diverse. Not everyone's experience. You may be a white person, but you may have had a very different experience of even race from other white people. Or of, the same would apply in gender, age, and other social areas. But one of the most, something we found very, very helpful was just the technique of questioning. So we asked, one of the most effective exercises was, well, generate questions for a dialogue. Just generate questions for it. And then discuss your questions. And that was very helpful because it exposed assumptions. For example, one person said she'd assumed that a dialogue about crime involving people in a formal area with people in an informal settlement would be only about crime in the informal settlement. And then she realized, hold on, I'm assuming that. I hadn't understood that I was assuming that. And finally, the value of focusing on experience, not on opinions. So we I think generally successfully kept away from people's opinions about things. And we said, rather talk to what you experienced and what was learned from that, or what you could have learned or didn't learn from that. Because if we get into a debate, we will be pulled back into, it's about Zemblias's point about emotional capital. What forms of emotion, what practices around emotions are most productive in moving us ahead in this area? So this is now Randall Collins, a very different approach, sociologist. He points out that we are actually hardwired as human beings for nonviolence, and that it's our habitus which has dragged us in the direction of violence. So, and he points out that often people who carry out violence are very, very tense, precisely because you're going against something that you're hardwired to do. So people often make terrible mistakes when they're trying to be violent. The gun goes off in the wrong direction and so on. But so we want always to connect with that innate sense of nonviolence. But in our context, violence is at the center. It's not at the periphery. It's mine. I mentioned, people I know who are involved in violence. We raise questions about our own capacity for violence. That we're not the good people versus the bad people. We are the people. We are the people, and we have a capacity for being violent ourselves. And so our aim is not about passing judgment so much as to create safety for honest and free communication. And we don't want dialogues or other interactions in education to be set up in ways that replicate and reinforce the existing habitus, because there is a failure then of transformation. So if we were doing this work in future, we would work more slowly. We would work in a more structured way, and we'd be more systematic. And that would be because we had learned from this first program. And thank you. That is the end of my presentation.
Thank you so much indeed, Crispin, for this wonderful presentation. It was really nice listening to you and all this analysis based on your research. And congratulations on this wonderful work, for sure. And now it's time for questions and comments from the audience, from the floor. You may raise your hand or put your question in chat, and we'll read it out loud for you. Yes, Angela James, please.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Crispin. Certainly, the points that are raised are, yeah, you know, we experience so much of this trauma, and it's not just trauma, but it's almost like when you're walking around, it's come to a point that when you're walking around, you almost need to be looking on all sides to see if you are safe wherever you are. It's actually, it's not a pleasant situation. Maybe that's what I want to say at this point in time. I'm from South Africa, and I know Crispin. So listening to you, and that's the one point I wanted to make, that our safety and is so compromised now that you actually do not know who you can trust, which is really a complete breakdown of the fabric of the community spirit that really needs to be there. And at the same time, I can also put a corollary to that and say that when the looting was happening in South Africa, there was a strengthening of a community, but it was them and us. Now, that is not the context, and that is not the type of relationships that one really wants to look forward to. It is about how we all are in community. The other point that I want, it's not a question, it's a comment, sorry. The other point that I wanted to make was when Crispin spoke about the sharing of experiences. Yeah, we certainly need to understand that when we're speaking about this, it really needs to be looked at in a holistic manner as well, because it's not just about me, myself, and the trauma or the experience that I'm going through. It's about where it comes from, where I come from, what is my presence, where am I going to, whom am I going to with, all of those particular aspects as well. And it's quite interesting that you raise the issue of violence in a society, or trying to teach non-violence in a society that's violent. Just this morning, I read about a local school not far from our university, where the children were burning their classrooms because there was their cell phones were taken away from them, and all the other things that they weren't supposed to have at school. So they turned around and they started burning. This is just now the other day. And I'm thinking, where have we gone wrong? Thank you.
Should I respond, George?
Yes, please.
Yeah, I think it would be good if I did, because and the one thought I have is that Angela is teaching not in the social sciences area so much, but these are universal issues for us in a violent society, and the sense. So the question that comes up for me is like, where should our attention first go? Because what happens in most cases of threat is the kind of defense, you know, how do we defend ourselves? And that can be very damaging. So how can we develop a community response that is genuinely not an us and a them? It is about us. And I actually witnessed some of that at that turmoil in July 2021, where in some areas, people were genuinely collaborating without social division and simply had a good strategy. And there were some specific examples. But yeah, I think our problem in our society, and I suspect in many African societies, is around this issue of trauma and the past. And something that Angela said was also like, where did we come from? You know, what happened with our ancestors? For me, that's a very significant question. And it's something that in an African context is much more readily understood than, say, in a Western context. But I became aware of it in terms of my own family history and thinking about that, and then taking a kind of African perspective on that, about the significance of ancestors and what happened to them and what was not resolved amongst them and how those issues affect us now. So that perspective, I think, can be valuable.
Wonderful. And John, please, Von John, you're welcome.
Thank you, George, and thank you, Crispin, for an enlightening presentation, and it's raised quite a few questions for me. I'm just going to ask one because it relates directly to two projects, and it's about the issue of, about creating a safe space and trying to manage, I think was the term you used, emotions, but not to re-traumatize. And what does one do when these processes, dialogue workshops or other kinds of similar interventions, re-traumatize? And I just want to give you the context. We ran an intervention where we created dialogue between South Africans and migrants from neighboring countries in the context of that other kind of violence that we've had, which is around xenophobia. And on one evening, even though we put in place kind of counseling and those kinds of safety measures, things really just fell apart completely. We were not prepared for the level of triggering of traumatic experiences amongst in the group, and it just collapsed, and we had to bring in additional support. So that's the one context. But we just yesterday met with Angela and other colleagues at the University of KwaZulu-Natal to plan the piloting of a toolkit that we created around the July violence that you've mentioned, for where teachers can start to engage in these critical conversations with learners. And here again, the issue that's come up is, how do we kind of prepare for contexts or incidents where we may be triggering quite traumatic experiences amongst learners or teachers. And especially in contexts like ours and in many other places where we don't have the kind of psychosocial services readily available in schools and community contexts. So I'm just asking what you did and whether you had any particular experiences in your dialogue workshops of where that kind of re-triggering or re-traumatizing emerged, and how do you deal with it, or how does one plan for it? Any thoughts on that? So thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Vaughan. I was just reading, it's a very good paper by Anthony Collins about teaching sensitive issues. He was teaching in psychology at UKZN. And he said he was not really prepared for what emerged in terms of people's experiences. And then he talks about some of the things that did trigger people very much at a kind of either individual level or collectively. For example, somebody said something quite, in the context of saying something very innocent, also said something very racist. So, I think it's still, he does write about strategies. One of them being to alert people to how you explain to people what your reactions are likely to be. You may well find you feeling this. Okay. And so where does that, so before it happens, you in a sense inoculate people by saying, well, if you take this example, what are your feelings? So by foregrounding feelings and discussing feelings and giving some sense of a engagement with feelings before we always go straight into the feelings, as it were, and then try and mop up, as it were, afterwards. That was just one idea. I don't think we always got it right in the course. There were a couple of breakdowns, I think, but at some points we did. A lot of it had to do with skills of facilitators, actually. People really understanding at a deep level what their job was to do. And funny enough, a very good person facilitated a dialogue which collapsed, and it wasn't disastrous, but it wasn't successful. And it was actually very helpful, and people took it in very good spirit, and there was a lot of criticism, but a lot of learning at the same time. So I think there are ways we could develop that area, because I think if it's an absolutely key issue that you're raising, because we want to do this work, and we, as South Africans, and I suspect in most societies, we have very few skills around doing it. But of course, there are programs, Alternatives to Violence Project, Healing of Memories, where people are developing those skills, and we've got to focus on that skills development. But it's not just skills, it's the emotional understanding that has to come with the skills development. I'm not answering very adequately, but I think there are some pointers in some of the literature. Oh, just by the way, George, I'm not a professor, but thank you for promoting me. I think it's long overdue.
Wonderful. Well, now more comments I can see in chat, and one is actually asking for a copy of the program or syllabus. If you could share that, that would be excellent. And somebody is also saying, oh, that's Dorica, that if violence can invade even the sanctuary of a school, a lot can be said regarding the current society. So it seems that, yeah, we have problems really at the place that should be free of violence in the first place, that's schools. And that, of course, tells us a lot about the society that we are living in. Okay, great. Thank you for your willingness to share the plans. Great, great. There's still some writing to do. Wonderful to know.
Mm-hmm.
So how can we see a school as a sanctuary? That's an interesting one. And if we can go to Vaughan, please.
Hi. Good morning. Good afternoon, everyone. Crispin, specifically as well on the question of schools becoming, schools supposedly being, should be a sanctuary, but the violence that takes place takes that away. Do you think that to a certain degree it could also be policies implemented by ministries of education around the world that sort of take away, in a sense, the authority of teachers to enact discipline, or even having conversations with students to deter them from acts of violence? Just as an example, 2 days ago, one of our teachers, we've been at school now for 2.5 weeks, and one of our teachers sent out progress reports to the parents, especially to those parents whose kids are showing difficulties, who are problematic, either because they're not doing the homework or they don't seem to understand quite what needs to be done, and so forth. And the parents were in an uproar against the teacher for sending out the reports so early. And the kids pick up on this, so they have a sense of, we don't need to listen to the teachers because my parents will back me up if I don't work, if I don't do anything. So do you think there is an element of, how can I put this, of taking away the authority of teachers that lends to this problem of violence in schools?
Yeah. What I think, and it's a very widespread development around the world, is this idea of a very rigid idea of what students have to get to by the end of their schooling. Now, I'm all in favor of setting high, very high goals, standards. But the anxiety about results in a quite rigid sort of way, and the ways in which curricula then become very constrained around those, I think is itself a fairly violent process, because it simply, people will not achieve those the way that is expected. And so failure then pervades the system. Anxiety pervades the system. A sense of lack of time, lack of engagement in depth with issues. And that can be in any area of study. It doesn't have to be only around these social issues. And my own teaching, I feel, has slowed down. I've asked people to, let's not try and cover all of this. Let's just go into greater depth and think more deeply about what we're doing. Now, it is now 49 years since I last taught at a secondary school. 50 years ago, almost exactly, I had an incident where I was sent as punishment for my views to a rural school, rural town. And on the first evening, I was expected to cane people. And I refused to do it. And that led to a huge so since I've rather lost touch with what people have to do, as it were, in this area. I'm not always sure about how I would manage if I was in a school now. I think that what I would do would be try to create a sense of common purpose in working with learners and with parents and with other teachers. But I think things are structured against that, the way most schools are run. I don't think I'm answering very well, Vaughan. And I think that some of these issues have to do with the expectations on different sides. There's no one, it's not only the officials who are doing this, it's not policymakers at a national level only. It's also what happens within the school.
Showed us about the levels of violence, and it was clear that Africa, and South Africa in particular, leads really, as it were, in the the levels of intensity of of violence, actually, vis-a-vis what is happening in the rest of the world. And is there some explanation really that can be given to also try and see how we can, solve the problem also?
Okay, so I mean, Vaughan van Eyck was phoning from Honduras. I know he was, he's linked to us from Honduras, and that's one of the other societies in the world which has extremely high levels of violence. And I think for similar reasons of history, one of the things that Adams points to in her work is the democratization, but feeble democratization. We have democracy, which is real in some ways, but it's not well entrenched in the society. So people just do things which violate the law with complete abandon, and often only some people ever get held responsible for that. And I think that's one of the aspects that feeds into the violence, that people feel that channels like going through to your police you know, are not going to be worthwhile, that maybe it's not a good idea to go the formal route. So you have to resolve issues independently. And I had a case recently of a perfectly reasonable friend of mine who killed 2 people and didn't go to the police. I mean, he was being attacked. He didn't go to the police. It's far too dangerous for him in that context where he lives to go to the police. Now, you know, that's pretty worrying. So it's around, and institutions are very vulnerable to being eaten out through corruption. We had cases in South Africa of just over a year ago, a whistleblower in a health department who saw a whole lot of what were pretty obviously corrupt invoices going through, raised a flag, reported it, and was then murdered. And it's taken a long time to get any clarity about what happened. Nobody has yet been charged. There are people now have been suspended a year later, when anyone looking at this would have seen, but hold on, there's somebody signing these invoices. Why are they not being interrogated as to what happened? So in this context, I was actually working with a master's student of mine, but I've known her since she was a youngster growing up in the one township. She's my master's student now, and she was working with a group of participants. Our taxi industry is extremely brutal. And one of her research participants was fined a huge sum of money by the local taxi association because her partner dropped her off in a car in the area. And she didn't take a taxi in. So they demanded money. And she had to withdraw whatever she could to hand over money. He had to hand over money. And my student was so enraged by this that she took up the issue. And what she did was she contacted an ally in the same industry, somebody who's seen as having authority, demanded a meeting with the taxi association and went there and actually forced them to back down and repay the money. Now, what this, I think, points to is that we have to have strategies that cross beyond the school. And maybe this is, in some ways, is something that perhaps I could say to Vaughan as well. We have to go beyond the school to find allies beyond our work. We have to find allies in politics, in the police, in business, and so on, to resolve these problems. So initiatives like that may be much more effective than trying to fight each battle purely within the narrow terrain that we're working in.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Yes, for this wonderful reply. And now to Vaughan, please.
Yeah, I just want to make 2 observations based on what Crispin said. Interestingly enough, we do have that problem of people resolving issues on their own instead of going to police, because here, and I found the same problem in Colombia as well, there's a massive distrust towards the police and other authoritative figures. People don't trust the police. A case in Colombia, for example, where a friend was hijacked close to a police station, and when he went to report, a policeman who's a friend of his was coming out and asked him what was going on, and he mentioned that he was going to report, and his police friend told him, don't report it at this police station, because the police at this police station are in cahoots with the guys that are hijacking people at the traffic light where he was hijacked. So if he reports it there, he will probably end up dead the next day. So there's a huge distrust towards the police, but also towards authority. And here in Honduras, the schools have a huge distrust towards politicians and authority figures, because they keep on implementing policies that are very uneducational, so to speak. And they usually send out a notice which says, obey and comply. Just a case in point, when the pandemic started, towards the end of the pandemic, there was a notice that came out that basically stated any school or teacher that obligates a student to go to class physically at the school will be fined and will serve a 5-year prison sentence. So it's sort of like everywhere we go to, it's, you know, we hit our heads against the block. Now, on the issue of violence, as part of my research, I studied the levels of violence in Honduras. And an interesting fact is that, yes, Honduras is considered one of the most violent, dangerous countries in the world based on the per 100,000 murders, violent deaths. But an interesting study, which is not widely published or shown to the media, is the fact that approximately 80% of those statistics are actually limited to the 5 major cities in the country, and within those cities, those elements are limited to very few neighborhoods. In one case, in the city of San Pedro Sula, which is considered the most violent of the cities, they actually have cases where neighborhoods that share similar socioeconomic elements, they find that in one neighborhood, it's actually very peaceful, where people can walk around late at night without any worries. But in the neighborhood right next to it, which shares the same socioeconomic elements, it has extreme levels of violence, where there are countless homicides on a daily basis. So it's, you know, it's the whole thing, it's the ancient thing where we mention that a country is extremely violent, but we don't mention that those levels of violence are limited to very small areas within the country. Now, I'm not sure, I'm a little bit out of touch with the statistics for South Africa and how widespread it really is. You would know better than me. But in Honduras, that is the case that I found. And even speaking to people have the concept of, in my city, which is actually a very peaceful city, the concept of, in those neighborhoods, you don't even want to drive around late at night, because even the police won't go to that neighborhood after 6 p.m. You know, but in another neighborhood, maybe 2 blocks away from that neighborhood, people are allowed to move around without any hassles or repercussions until late at night. So it's a very skewed sense of violence in terms of, it makes it sound as if every corner of the country experiences those levels of violence.
So I would say in South Africa, I'm not sure, as I don't know so much depth of the statistics, but my impression is that there certainly are much safer areas than others. But we do get, of course, developments where you've got middle-class people in enclaves, which are very peaceful internally, unless, of course, you sometimes people bring the violence in there with them. And we had this famous killing of a model by her partner, Oscar Pistorius, in exactly such an enclave. But I think, and I live in a very middle-class area, I think the area around us is pretty violent. People, I can walk freely in some down the road. I wouldn't go around the corner over there and so on without some real thought to how I was going to get, you know, who's going to be with me and so on. So, but I think, interesting enough, somebody does some work for me in the nature reserve here, and the other day he said he's got a problem because he lives in an informal settlement. He has a house in another area that he rents out. He rented it out to a police officer And then the neighbors said to him, listen, that guy is a criminal. You think it was safe because it's a police officer. No, it's not. It's not. Your property is being used for criminal purposes. So there is that, I see this word trust deficit. There's a huge deficit in the trust of institutions. And what this points to is that we have to develop non-violent ways of building up institutions so that they have genuine sense of respect and commitment. When we had very damaging floods in this area in April, there were some community initiatives which are absolutely remarkable in addressing like physical problems, like rebuilding bridges in record time. People just did it themselves because they couldn't afford to wait for 3 years for the authorities to do it. You know, so there are a possible growth of possible alternative ways of handling things which are fundamentally not violent and are communal and reflect African values of Ubuntu, practices that have been well researched. Our colleague Yala has written about this extensively. Yeah.
Great. And Afiz, are you there?
I'm there.
How are you today?
I'm good. I'm great.
Probably there's something that rings a bell. You know, when you think about South Africa and Nigeria.
Exactly, but the kind of idea that I had about South Africa is different from what I had from this presentation. And it's very strange to me that there is still violence in some areas in South Africa. Because what I heard is that, or what I will say that I know, is that South Africa is free of violence in talking about in terms of Africa generally. Because if you look at their development level, it's not as the same thing as in Nigeria we are experiencing here, especially the northern part of Nigeria. The northern part of Nigeria are actually experiencing a lot of violence, both religious, politically, and economically. But on our western part of Nigeria that I am, there is not such radical violence as that. The only thing we are experiencing in our area is the new policy that the Lagos State, one of the states in the western part of Nigeria, that they come up with, that they want to buy they are trying to put a ban on cycling, that is bike. And they were like trying to protest that. And generally overall, there is ASU strike, which says that all the students in the university must be at home for like past going to 7 months now or more than. So they are not actually bringing solution to it. But that's why I keep silent that I couldn't comment on South Africa, that I still need to do more research. Based on this presentation, I think I've learned a lot of things that I need to actually dabble into to more research on South Africa's situation in terms of violence.
Thank you so much, Afiz, for your input.
Thank you, sir.
It's a pleasure.
Just
it's a pleasure having you as always. Yes,
I
please.
mean, it's really interesting, but you know, and I think people in South Africa think that the rest of Africa is very violent. But then we have people coming from neighboring, even from Zimbabwe, which has had its real troubles, and then being very disturbed by the level of violence they experience here. So we mustn't conflate violence and lack of development. You know, we could have countries with low level of industrial development, which are much more peaceful and the alternative. And in my view, the kind of problems that we experience in South Africa may be becoming closer to the problems that are experienced in those problems may be actually starting to appear in other societies. So, for example, in the United States, for the first time in many, many years, we've seen a real assault on democracy. I mean, the undermining of the institutions of democracy in a way that we wouldn't have seen, in 80, 100 years, whatever, more than that, possibly. So, the attack on democratic institutions, the undermining, and patterns of violence, perhaps spreading in some ways, even though we also have examples in South Africa and elsewhere of effective countermeasures to reduce violence. Yeah. Maybe we should draw this to a conclusion around that point. If anybody wants to communicate with me, by all means, just email me. I don't have a blueprint at present for a course, but I really do have a sense of how we would do it, and I've got to work on it. It's part of my doctoral study.
Thank you so much for that. And I would like also to ask you, as we ask our presenters, if they could share, their presentation in form of a book chapter. I will be publishing a handbook on peace and nonviolence with Springer, and we have the deadline for submission of chapters in November, so November the 30th of November. So if you could find some time to prepare that chapter, that would be excellent. And we ask, of course, everybody else also to think about, contributing a chapter. This will be actually our third book. We are still working actually on the first book, and we have made some good progress. Hopefully soon now, sooner than later, the book will be out. So I'm trying to see whether there's something I can read out here in chat. This looks interesting from Lokong. And she's saying, I believe violence in South Africa can be reduced, but with the recent waves of Operation Dudula and people believing they can, there's something that is preventing me from reading this.
Yeah, it's the recent waves of Operation Dudula. This is an organization that formed, and it's basically attacking African foreigners in a very racist way. And in fact, there have been some violent protests outside hospitals where this grouping has insisted on checking who's going in and trying to keep African foreigners out, including African foreigners who may be, or people originally from other countries, who may be on the staff of the hospital as well. The one interesting phenomenon is people organizing in resistance to that and to protect the rights of people to enter these hospitals and to be treated. So there's both the negative forces and there are countervailing things as well that are happening.
Wonderful. So on that note, I would like to take this opportunity to thank you again, Crispin, for the wonderful presentation. We have definitely learned quite a lot, and we're going to ask you to present to us another time when you can find the opportunity to do so. I can see Afiz is clapping for you. I'm joining him and the rest of the participants. And I thank everybody else also for your participation. You are always welcome. It's a pleasure having you, and we are going to meet again next Wednesday. It's always on Wednesday, not Thursday, Crispin. So the World Wednesday webinar. And so actually in 2 weeks' time, we'll be also celebrating the International Peace Day. I would like to invite you, and we are going to see how we can make this one, you know, worth the day. So thank you very much indeed, and all the best.
Thanks ever so much.
Thank you.
I felt very welcome
you.
indeed.
Thank you so much.
Great. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank
Goodbye.
you. Next time.
Bye.
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 Good.
Goodbye, everyone.